Beneath the veneer of progressive civil rights advancements in America lies a meticulously constructed web of subversive influence, orchestrated by a tightly knit cluster of organizations that emerged in the early 20th century. These entities, the American Jewish Committee, AJC, 1906, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, 1909, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, 1913, the American Jewish Congress, AJ Congress, 1918, and the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, 1920, along with the later Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, 1971, have systematically manipulated the legal architecture of discrimination, hate crimes, and protected characteristics. What masqueraded as noble responses to societal injustices rapidly evolved into an interconnected apparatus for control, drafting vague legislation, subverting its interpretation through self-serving definitions, and enforcing compliance via litigation and pressure campaigns. This network, disproportionately driven by Jewish founders, leaders, and funders despite comprising only 2 to 3% of the U.S. population, has engineered a century-long subversion of American norms. From landmark laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to hate crime enhancements and the imposition of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, these groups have embedded mechanisms that allow them to act as creators, arbiters, and punishers. The result is an insidious feedback loop. Intentionally ambiguous statutes are pushed through with their advocacy, then manipulated via reports, trainings, and lawsuits to target specific enemies while shielding preferred groups. This essay exposes the historical buildup of this manipulative system, its generational escalation, the subjective subversion of concepts like hate, and its entrenchment as an unaccountable shadow authority over speech, employment, and association in a nation of over 330 million. Origins of subversion. The Emergent Network, 1906 to 1920. The foundations of the subversive network were laid between 1906 and 1920 in the urban strongholds of New York and Chicago, where a series of organizations emerged not merely as defensive bodies but as strategic tools for long-term manipulation of American society. The American Jewish Committee, established in 1906 by affluent German Jewish elites such as Louis Marshall and Jacob Schiff, initially posed as a diplomatic organization focused on international Jewish interests, lobbying foreign governments on behalf of persecuted communities abroad. However, this facade quickly dissolved as the AJC turned its gaze inward, subverting domestic policies by challenging immigration quotas and university admissions restrictions that were seen as barriers to Jewish socio-economic ascent. These efforts were framed as fights against bigotry, but in reality, they represented a calculated infiltration of American institutions, using elite connections to erode traditional gatekeeping mechanisms that had maintained cultural and economic balances. By portraying any opposition as irrational prejudice, the AJC set a precedent for reframing legitimate societal concerns, such as overrepresentation in certain professions or radical political involvements, as mere hatred, thereby justifying the creation of permanent advocacy apparatuses. This early subversion was not haphazard. It drew on a deep reservoir of communal resources, including philanthropic funds from banking families, to build alliances that would later extend into multiracial coalitions, all while maintaining a core agenda of advancing Jewish interests under broader humanitarian guises. The NAACP, cunningly co-founded in 1909 and heavily financed by Jewish figures like the Spingarn brothers, Joel and Arthur, who dominated its leadership for decades, and supported by rabbis among its original signatories, exemplified this hijacking tactic. What appeared as altruistic support for black civil rights was, in essence, a strategic co-optation, using the NAACP as a proxy to test legal strategies that could be repurposed for Jewish causes, such as combating defamation and exclusion. This period marked the birth of a manipulative ecosystem, where organizations were designed with interlocking purposes. Defense masked offense, and minority protection concealed ambitions for broader societal control. The Anti-Defamation League, launched in 1913 under the B'nai B'rith umbrella in Chicago by Sigmund Livingston, began with the pretext of combating anti-Semitic stereotypes in media and public discourse but swiftly expanded into a surveillance and suppression machine, monitoring individuals and groups deemed threatening to Jewish narratives. This expansion was no accident. It involved compiling dossiers on critics, pressuring publishers, and initiating boycotts, all under the banner of anti-defamation, which effectively subverted free speech by labeling dissent as hate. The American Jewish Congress, 1918, founded by Rabbi Stephen S. Wise and infused with Zionist priorities, further amplified this network by emphasizing international minority rights while domestically pushing for policies that aligned with emerging globalist agendas. Meanwhile, the American Civil Liberties Union, 1920, with its heavy Jewish legal cadre including figures like Felix Frankfurter, operated under the guise of defending free speech but selectively applied its principles, often prioritizing cases that advanced radical social changes while ignoring or undermining conservative viewpoints. These were no isolated efforts. Overlapping board members, such as those shared between the AJC and NAACP, and shared funding streams from philanthropists like Julius Rosenwald, revealed a deliberate interlocking directorate aimed at coordination without overt conspiracy. Coordinated campaigns, such as the orchestrated takedown of Henry Ford's exposés in the 1920s through legal threats and public smears, demonstrated how this network could mobilize collectively to silence powerful voices, setting templates for future deplatforming tactics. The subversion here was structural. By presenting themselves as disparate entities, they avoided scrutiny while functioning as a unified front, infiltrating media, academia, and politics to reshape public perceptions of discrimination. Geographically concentrated in Jewish enclaves and leveraging pre-existing communal structures like B'nai B'rith lodges, which served as recruitment and coordination hubs, the network positioned itself as the unchallenged authority on extremism and discrimination, dictating narratives that marginalized alternative interpretations. The era's challenges, university quotas, residential covenants, and professional exclusions, whether rooted in legitimate concerns over economic competition, political radicalism, or cultural clashes, were systematically reframed as pure, unprovoked prejudice to justify the establishment of permanent institutions with expansive mandates. This reframing was a masterstroke of manipulation, turning societal responses into evidence of inherent bias, thereby empowering the network to demand remedies that enhanced their influence. By the 1930s, these groups had already begun subverting state-level laws with anti-discrimination drafts, collaborating on model legislation that planted seeds for a post-war revolution. This early entrenchment ensured that their control would extend far beyond their demographic weight, creating a legacy of subversion where a small minority could dictate terms to the majority through institutional capture and narrative dominance. The emergent network's genius lay in its longevity. Designed for adaptation, it evolved from reactive defense to proactive manipulation, embedding itself in the fabric of American civil society and paving the way for generations of escalating influence. Crafting the trap, legislative subversion, and the control feedback mechanism. The so-called civil rights victories of the mid-20th century were masterstrokes of legislative subversion, engineered by this network to implant exploitable vagueness into the heart of American law, ensuring perpetual opportunities for manipulation. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, dominated by Jewish attorneys like Jack Greenberg, who succeeded Thurgood Marshall and steered it through pivotal decades, meticulously drafted key sections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These drafts embedded broad, ambiguous prohibitions in Titles 6 and 7, prohibiting discrimination in federally funded programs and employment, but intentionally leaving terms like discrimination open-ended to invite endless interpretive expansion. This vagueness was no oversight. It was a deliberate trap, allowing future redefinitions to encompass not just overt acts but subtle disparities, thereby subverting neutral policies under doctrines like disparate impact. The Anti-Defamation League, meanwhile, crafted model hate crime statutes in the 1980s and 1990s, subtly designed for overreach and adopted in various forms by 46 states, which permitted enhanced punishments based on subjective, bias determinations that could be twisted to target ideological opponents. These legislative efforts were bolstered by coalition building, where Jewish-led organizations allied with Black and other minority groups to push through reforms, all while retaining steering control over the outcomes. The subversion extended to executive actions, such as influencing federal guidelines that amplified these laws' reach into private sectors, creating a web of compliance that entangled businesses and institutions in perpetual oversight. Once these laws were in place, the manipulators did not retreat. Instead, they entrenched themselves as perpetual overseers, monitoring and subverting implementation to align with their agendas. Through annual audits of anti-Semitic incidents and comprehensive hate maps, the ADL and SPLC fabricated metrics that infiltrated official channels, being cited authoritatively by the FBI, Department of Education, and major corporations as benchmarks for policy and enforcement. This infiltration persisted until public backlash, fueled by exposures of methodological biases and overreach, led to severed ties in late 2025, marking a rare setback. Trainings provided to law enforcement and educators, complaints filed with regulatory bodies, and strategic lawsuits further subverted neutral application, pushing expansive doctrines like disparate impact, which penalized policies based on statistical outcomes rather than intent, effectively reversing traditional burdens of proof and enabling reverse discrimination claims. The SPLC's role in designating hate groups added another layer, influencing private platforms to deplatform entities without due process, extending state-like power into the digital realm. This overseer function was subversive at its core, transforming advocacy groups into quasi-governmental entities that dictated compliance standards, often prioritizing their definitions over legislative intent. This feedback mechanism operates as a ratchet of control, ingeniously structured to advance unidirectionally, draft vague laws under the cover of broad coalitions, manipulate monitoring to fabricate evidence of non-compliance, litigate aggressively for broader interpretations through amicus briefs and test cases, then lobby for amendments to close alleged loopholes that further solidify gains. Opposition is systematically neutralized by branding it as pro-discrimination or tolerant of hate, rendering repeal or narrowing politically suicidal in a climate of manufactured moral panic. Rarely in American history has a single advocacy cluster achieved such simultaneous and unchecked roles: creator of laws, interpreter of their meanings, and enforcer of compliance, bypassing democratic accountability and subverting the constitutional separation of powers into what amounts to a private fiefdom of influence. This configuration maximizes subversion by minimizing transparency, allowing the network to evolve laws in real time through iterative pressure, ensuring that once embedded, their control becomes self-perpetuating and resistant to external challenges. Weaponizing definitions: the manipulation of hate and symbolic subversion. The network's most potent weapon is its monopoly on defining reality itself, subverting fluid concepts like hate, bias, and discrimination into tools of ideological warfare that silence opposition and enforce conformity. The Anti-Defamation League's ADL aggressive promotion of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance (IHRA) working definition of anti-Semitism, originally a non-binding guideline adopted in 2016, has been masterfully manipulated to infiltrate federal executive orders, dozens of state laws, and campus policies by 2025, equating legitimate criticism of Israeli policies with ancient hatreds and thereby triggering investigations, deplatforming, and career ruin for dissenters. This definition, which describes anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews, includes controversial examples that blur the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, allowing the ADL to weaponize it against academics, activists, and politicians who question Israeli actions. For instance, in 2025, Columbia University explicitly incorporated IHRA examples into its policies, as outlined in a memo identifying them for U.S. Department of Education compliance, effectively subverting free speech on campuses by classifying certain protests as discriminatory. Similarly, New York City's Executive Order 52 in June 2025 mandated city agencies to consider the IHRA definition, extending its manipulative reach into municipal governance and law enforcement trainings. Wisconsin lawmakers debated adopting it in September 2025, amid criticisms that it could target anti-Israel activism, further illustrating how this tool subverts open debate into prosecutable offense. By 2025, with endorsements from 46 countries and widespread U.S. adoptions, the IHRA has become a quasi-legal standard, manipulated by the network to redefine boundaries of acceptable discourse and punish ideological foes. Similarly, the Southern Poverty Law Center's SPLC arbitrary hate group designations function as extra-legal blacklists, denying labeled organizations access to banking, fundraising platforms, and public venues without trial or appeal. One man's patriot transformed into another's extremist through subjective fiat that lacks due process. Critics, including prominent Republicans and political observers, have lambasted these designations as biased, leading to lawsuits and accusations of pushing false narratives against conservative groups. In 2025, the SPLC's Year in Hate and Extremism report documented 1,371 hate and anti-government groups, but its methodology has been accused of inflating numbers to justify expanded surveillance and deplatforming. Symbols, gestures, and slogans are reclassified overnight via ADL and SPLC reports and trainings disseminated to police, schools, and tech firms, stripping away context and intent to enforce ideological uniformity, such as labeling certain patriotic symbols as extremist indicators. The ADL's 2024 to 2025 Portrait of Anti-Semitic Experiences report, for example, highlighted rising incidents based on self-reported data, which critics argue skews perceptions to amplify calls for more restrictive policies. Virginia State Police's 2025 agreement with the ADL for comprehensive trainings further embeds this manipulative influence into law enforcement, where officers are indoctrinated with network-curated definitions of hate. This pervasive reach extends to private sectors, where companies adopt these blacklists to avoid liability, effectively subverting economic freedoms under the guise of social responsibility. This arbitration inverts the original intent of civil rights laws. What were designed as shields against genuine harm become swords wielded against dissent, with the same network retaining veto power over meanings and interpretations that favor their agendas. Self-generated incident data from skewed criteria, such as the ADL's hate crime maps and SPLC's monthly dispatches on hard-right trends, justifies relentless calls for more laws, enhanced trainings, and private enforcement mechanisms, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of subversion that erodes free discourse under the banner of protection. In 2025, amid growing scrutiny, organizations like the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, SEGM, rejected SPLC labels as hate groups, accusing them of peddling pseudoscience accusations to silence debate. The Alliance Defending Freedom has similarly critiqued the SPLC for targeting mainstream conservatives, highlighting how these designations manipulate public opinion and institutional policies. This cycle is amplified by partnerships like the ADL's collaborations on hate crime analyses, which influence federal strategies and state-level adoptions, turning advocacy into unchecked authority. Ultimately, by controlling the lexicon of hate, the network subverts democratic principles, transforming protective statutes into instruments of censorship and control that stifle alternative viewpoints and perpetuate their dominance. Escalating dominance, generational manipulation, and the suppression of alternatives. The trajectory across generations reveals a relentless escalation in the manipulative scope of this network, evolving from early 20th century subversion of basic barriers like university quotas and anti-lynching laws under the cover of inclusion to mid-century expansions that introduced punitive hate crime enhancements and liability shifts through doctrines like disparate impact. Rooted in the Reconstruction era's failed promises of equality post-Civil War, where federal protections for former slaves were undermined by backlash and Jim Crow laws, the network has capitalized on historical grievances to manipulate civil rights frameworks over decades. By the 1960s, landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, banning discrimination in public accommodations, education, and employment, were subverted through vague language that allowed for generational reinterpretations, fostering a backlash that still shapes American politics today. In the 21st century, this escalation has manipulated frameworks to mandate diversity indoctrination in workplaces and schools, track non-criminal bias incidents via reporting systems, and even interpret misgendering as prosecutable hate under expanded hostile environment claims in certain jurisdictions. Project 2025's distortions of civil rights law, for instance, threaten to dismantle disparate impact protections, which the network has long used to penalize neutral policies disproportionately affecting favored groups. This generational shift transforms defensive advocacy into offensive tools, subverting original intents to enforce ideological conformity across society. Alternatives to this dominance are systematically suppressed through a minefield of precedents established via out-of-court settlements, Department of Education Dear Colleague letters, and corporate policy adoptions that embed network definitions into everyday operations, where any reversal invites manipulated smears of bigotry and extremism. Media alliances, often aligned with the network's narratives, amplify these attacks, portraying challengers as regressive forces seeking to revive unchecked discrimination. This oppression is evident in the isolated 2025 FBI partnership severances with the ADL and SPLC, initiated by Director Kash Patel in October amid conservative pressure and accusations of bias, marking rare cracks in an otherwise impregnable facade built over decades. Despite these breaks, which followed revelations of the SPLC's troubling history of false accusations and the ADL's inclusion of conservative groups in extremism glossaries, the network's influence persists through entrenched trainings and data-sharing agreements with other agencies. The ADL's ongoing law enforcement outreach, including new agreements like the one with Virginia State Police in 2025, ensures continued manipulation of hate crime responses. This resilience highlights how the network subverts counter-movements by leveraging coalition capture and expertise monopolies to maintain dominance. Influence accrues not through overt conspiracy but via engineered path dependence, where historical precedents from the civil rights movement, such as the generational comparisons to modern struggles, lock in advantages that resist contraction, transforming what began as advocacy for equality into a mechanism for suppressing alternatives. By embedding themselves in federal strategies to counter anti-Semitism and hate, as seen in the ADL's calls for solidarity against hate-fueled violence, the network perpetuates a cycle of escalation that demands criminal justice reforms aligned with their priorities while dismissing opposing views as extremist. In 2025, amid reports like the SPLC's monthly intelligence dispatches tracking hard-right trends, this manipulation continues to shape policy, even as pushbacks like the FBI severances expose vulnerabilities. Ultimately, this generational manipulation ensures offensive dominance, subverting democratic processes by turning civil rights tools into instruments that preempt and neutralize any viable alternatives before they can gain traction. Conclusion: the entrenched subversion of American norms. The edifice of American civil rights law stands revealed as a profoundly subverted structure, bearing the indelible marks of manipulation by a cluster of organizations rooted in early 20th century Jewish activism. The Anti-Defamation League, ADL, American Jewish Committee, AJC, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, through their disproportionate founding, funding, and ongoing direction, have masterfully engineered a self-sustaining system of control. What began as ostensibly defensive measures against perceived injustices has morphed into a comprehensive apparatus where these entities simultaneously draft ambiguous legislation, arbitrarily define its scope through biased interpretations, and ruthlessly discipline any deviations via litigation, public shaming, and institutional pressure. This triad of roles, creator, arbiter, and enforcer, allows them to transform broad, universal protections intended for equality into precision-targeted instruments of ideological control, selectively wielded to suppress dissent while advancing hidden agendas. The demographic reality underscores the subversion. Representing merely 2 to 3% of the population, this network has achieved outsized dominance, leveraging historical narratives of victimhood to embed mechanisms that prioritize their interests over national sovereignty. From hate crime enhancements to the imposition of the IHRA anti-Semitism definition across federal and state levels, the legal landscape now reflects not democratic consensus but the calculated imposition of minority priorities, eroding the foundational principles of free speech and equal protection under the law. This subversion is not accidental but a deliberate architecture, built over a century to infiltrate and reshape the very norms that govern American society, turning civil rights into a facade for perpetual power consolidation. This entrenched subversion manifests in a one-way ratchet mechanism, ingeniously designed to resist any meaningful reform while continuously expanding its reach. Challenges to this system, such as legislative attempts to narrow disparate impact doctrines or corporate decisions to reject ADL-guided content moderation, are invariably met with orchestrated outrage, amplified through allied media outlets and coalition partners who frame opposition as complicity in hatred or bigotry. The 2025 severances of FBI partnerships with the ADL and SPLC, prompted by revelations of biased data manipulation, represent rare pushbacks that expose underlying vulnerabilities, yet they remain isolated incidents amid a sea of institutional capture. Universities, corporations, and government agencies remain deeply entangled, reliant on these organizations' trainings, reports, and designations for compliance, creating a dependency that stifles independent scrutiny. Even as public awareness grows regarding the subjective arbitration of hate symbols and the weaponization of Title VI investigations, the depth of entrenchment, rooted in decades of precedent and expertise monopoly, ensures that reversal demands extraordinary political will, often thwarted by accusations of extremism. This resilience is the hallmark of true subversion, not overt domination, but a subtle, interlocking web that adapts to threats, co-opting reforms into further consolidations of power and rendering the system virtually impervious to democratic accountability. Ultimately, this represents a triumphant subversion on a grand scale, a minority network, harnessing historical grievances, strategic brilliance, and relentless generational escalation, has successfully manipulated the legal boundaries of a global superpower. Imposing its priorities on speech, association, and societal conduct at large, this cluster has elevated interest group advocacy to quasi-governmental authority, operating with minimal oversight in a domain it essentially created. The implications extend far beyond civil rights. By controlling the definitions of permissible discourse and protected identities, these organizations influence elections, corporate policies, and cultural narratives, subtly steering the nation toward conformity with their worldview. While cracks appear, evidenced by increasing scrutiny and occasional institutional retreats, the overall victory is undeniable, as the framework they built continues to shape the lives of over 330 million Americans from the shadows of early 20th century origins. This is not mere influence, but a profound reconfiguration of power, where a small, interconnected elite has subverted the democratic process to perpetuate its dominance, raising urgent questions about the erosion of national autonomy in the face of such sophisticated manipulation. Addendum: Ancient Roots of Manipulation, Jewish Networks and Their Subversive Impact on American Structures. The subversive prowess of modern Jewish advocacy networks traces its origins to antiquity, where the exigencies of diasporic survival forged intricate structures of covert control and manipulation, ensuring communal resilience amid perpetual displacement. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, following the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BCE, scattered Jewish communities and necessitated the emergence of synagogues as multifunctional nodes, not merely for worship but for clandestine trade coordination, internal legal arbitration under halakha, and mutual aid systems that deftly bypassed host authorities, allowing influence to permeate local economies and societies. This model intensified after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, which propelled the Great Diaspora, transforming synagogues into proto-institutions for education, ritual, and communal governance across the Mediterranean and beyond. Far from passive shelters, these early synagogues evolved into dynamic centers that emphasized prayer, study, and strategic alliances, enabling scattered groups to maintain cultural hegemony and economic leverage despite minority status. In the Hellenistic period, under figures like Ptolemy II, who commissioned the Septuagint translation around 280 BCE, synagogues in places like Alexandria became architectural prototypes for broader influence, blending religious facade with subversive networking that infiltrated Greek and Roman spheres. This ancient blueprint of adaptability, rooted in exile and refined through centuries, laid the groundwork for a manipulative ethos, survival through infiltration, where communal bonds masked ambitions for disproportionate sway over host cultures. In medieval Europe, these networks matured into ruthlessly efficient self-governing entities known as kahilot, which operated as autonomous corporations with legal status under feudal systems, collecting taxes, resolving internal disputes via rabbinic courts, and enforcing collective loyalty through interlocking societies like burial guilds, chevra kadisha, and charitable funds. Deploying court Jews, influential financiers and advisors like Josel of Rosheim or Samuel Oppenheimer, these communities manipulated rulers through economic leverage and intelligence, securing privileges amid pogroms and restrictions while amplifying power far beyond demographic proportions. Repeated expulsions, such as those from England in 1290 or Spain in 1492, honed this subversive adaptability, with Sephardic traders establishing hidden alliances across Mediterranean and Atlantic empires, facilitating trade and espionage under religious pretexts. The Kahilot's internal courts, often arbitrating via ad hoc panels, Zabla, mirrored broader European judicial subversion, allowing Jews to navigate Christian hostility while building parallel power structures. This era's genius lay in transforming vulnerability into veiled dominance. Court Jews not only funded wars and states but influenced policies, embedding Jewish interests into the fabric of European absolutism from the 16th century onward. Such mechanisms enforced communal discipline and external manipulation, turning diaspora into a strategic advantage that perpetuated influence through generations of calculated resilience. Transplanted to America, these ancient patterns subverted new frontiers, beginning with the arrival of 23 Sephardic Jews in New Amsterdam in 1654, establishing Congregation Shearith Israel as a blended religious facade for advocacy, welfare manipulation, and civic infiltration amid colonial restrictions. B'nai B'rith, founded in 1843 by German Jewish immigrants in New York, nationalized fraternal control, providing mutual aid while preempting anti-Semitism defenses, culminating in its 1913 creation of the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, to monitor and suppress critics. Massive Eastern European immigration from 1820 to 1924, peaking at over 2 million between 1880 to 1924, densified synagogues as manipulation hubs, dispensing aid to steer political allegiance and integrate newcomers into advocacy networks. Denominational unions and the Synagogue Council of America, 1926, centralized lobbying, funneling resources into the 1906 to 1920 organizations, with leaders like Rabbi Stephen S. Wise bridging sacred and secular subversion. Post-war suburban Jewish community centers, JCCs, masked continued coordination, evolving into modern escalations where national umbrellas like the Conference of Presidents, founded 1956, manipulate Congress on Israel and anti-Semitism issues. Overrepresentation in law, estimated 10 to 15% of attorneys in judiciary, and politics, 10 Jewish senators in 2025, comprising 10% of the Senate, subverts precedents and pushes bills like the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, reintroduced in February 2025 to codify IHRA definitions. From ancient resilience to modern dominance, these interlocking nodes sustain a manipulative loop, creating laws, arbitrating violations, enforcing compliance, subverting American institutions despite sporadic resistance.